Hello, it's Craig here with a breakdown for spears. Before we start, I have a short announcement. Because many of you asked whether I have a Discord, I decided to make one. I'm quite new to managing Discord and adding the bots and stuff, so bear with me. But this will be where I'll be listing my resources for the games I cover and also updates on the channel or resources. You can also hop onto the server if you have any questions, want to make a suggestion, or just want to hang out. I'll see you guys there. Anyway, back to spears. As per usual, the weapon breakdown will be split into unique and regular weapons. For the regular weapons, I'll be splitting the weapons into these categories because of their similarities. If you haven't watched my damage calculation video or softcaps guide, they are linked in the description down below and will help you better understand the optimization done in this video. Let's start off with the spear ranges. Unlike straight swords with the weapon ranges bunched up all together, there are clearer and larger differences in spear range, which should definitely be considered, especially because it is one of the best weapon types when it comes to spacing. Pike is extraordinarily long, and the bolt of Gransax is significantly longer than the other spears as well. The Torchpole is quite long too, but, well, you'll see. Among the other bunched up options, Cross Naginata, probably the most popular regular spear at the moment, is the longest, which definitely contributes to its popularity and power. Next, we have to cover one important detail about spears in general, and that is counter hit damage, which only applies to piercing damage. What this means is, if your weapon has a physical portion and a non-physical portion, like the bolt of Gransax, only your physical damage gets the bonus. Even without the talisman, thrusting weapons do more damage on counter hits. After an enemy attacks, there is a brief window where their versus pierce negation is reduced by 30%, which is multiplicative. And yes, your negation can become negative. The longer the animation of the recovery is, the longer the counter hit window is, so you can more easily see this effect if you're using a move like the Spear Collar Ritual with a Death Ritual Spear. The Spear Talisman buffs this reduction when you attack a vulnerable enemy by an additional 15%. Finally, since weapons can have different movesets, it is important to talk about their motion values, or damage percent, rather than just looking at their attack rating, otherwise known as AR. I will also be going over spears with significantly different movesets, but same motion values. This is the regular normal attack chain of spears. This is the unique regular attack chain of the Cross Naginata. The first and third hit of the 4-move chain looks like slashing attacks, but they actually do standard physical damage, which means they're calculated versus the opponent's normal physical defense and negation, rather than versus slash. This is a normal spear's heavy attack. This is the unique upward thrusting heavy attack of the pike, which is honestly a shame because this is the longest spear, and this heavy attack is comparatively short in range. It doesn't even do more damage, status damage, stamina damage, or poise damage than a regular heavy attack. It's completely the same except for the animation. This is the heavy attack of the Partisan, Death Ritual Spear, and Spike Spear. This heavy attack is a swipe sideways. It deals standard physical damage and not slashing damage. This is the heavy attack of the Short Spear and Cleanrot Spear. I quite like this heavy attack because it's quick and deals more damage, status damage, and stamina damage. This is a normal spear's charged heavy attack. This is the unique charged heavy attack of the pike. This charged version has slightly higher MV than the regular heavy attack, but the heavy attack isn't good already. You wouldn't charge it for the tiny bit of extra damage. This is the charged heavy attack of the Partisan, Death Ritual Spear, and Spike Spear. It also deals standard damage. This is the charged heavy attack of the Short Spear and Cleanrot Spear. The second charged heavy attack of the Short Spear and Cleanrot Spear is actually 3 hits instead of 2 hits, which deals much more damage. What I like to do is to use an uncharged version of the first heavy attack, followed by a charged version of the second. Alright, with all the basic information out of the way, let's talk about the weapons individually, starting from a crowd favorite, the bolt of Gransax. From the way things have been going for quality looking unique weapons from my previous videos, like the Bloodhound's Fang, which prefers investing into strength before going for AT dexterity, you might think the bolt of Gransax should work the same way. But no. You're better off just investing 20 points into strength, and then making a dash for 80 dexterity after the 58 dexterity breakpoint. Which brings me to something I want to bring up. The amount of AR gained from investing into more dexterity is very minimal for the Bolt of Gransax. For a whole 22 stat points, you're only getting 6.2% more AR. This is caused by the awkward strength and dexterity scaling it has, which isn't easy to see by just looking at a D and C scaling on a sheet. If you plan on min-maxing for the Bolt of Gransax, I highly recommend hitting 20 strength and 58 dexterity, and spending the rest of the points on stats like vigor and endurance to make yourself tankier instead. I know this might not sit well with many people who want fat damage, but the Tank of Gransax build will make your overall performance better even if you have to drop some damage because of how relatively inefficient it is at gaining AR, but how efficient it is at quickly hitting a certain AR due to its split scaling and stat distribution. Next, the Torchpole is unsurprisingly just a Torchpole. That fire damage doesn't even scale to your stats. At least it glows, I guess. Death Ritual Spear is another one of those weirdly distributed weapons, with its weapon art Spear Collar Ritual scaling harder to intelligence, but having a lower magic damage and poor intelligence scaling. But if you're going to use this weapon, it's likely because you want to use the weapon art. If you just want a good poking stick, there are better choices like the Bolt of Gransax. The weapon art is decent, especially against larger enemies, because you can hit more times. It also has decent poise damage. You can stagger the troll outside Godric's room with the very beginning of the third weapon art. As a bonus, this is the only spear with 110 critical instead of 100, which means it has 10% higher MV for backstabs and riposts. This is a decent bonus considering how much poise damage you can deal with a weapon art, but I wouldn't say it is that significant in the bigger picture when you're choosing spears. Crystal Spear and Rotten Crystal Spear are very similar, so I'll cover them together. The Rotten version basically has 55 Scarlet Rod buildup, but a bit less AR. My typical suggestion is to go with a Scarlet Rod Spear if you have other sources of Scarlet Rod buildup. If not, you can just use the Crystal Spear for a bit more attack rating, if you're unlikely to proc Scarlet Rot in most fights. Also, despite its intelligence scaling, it has really poor magic damage. You should ignore the intelligence portion while keeping in mind that its attack is split scaled. Overall, we can see that the Crystal Spear does not have that great an attack rating compared to the other spear options, quite unlike its straight sword counterpart, the Crystal Sword. And Charge Forth isn't that great of a weapon art. If we think back to its range, it is also on the shorter side. Therefore, I don't recommend either of the weapons unless you want the Rotten Crystal Spear because you want a spear with Scarlet Rot buildup on your offhand. The Inquisitor's Girandole has the same exact strength and dexterity scaling. It is also quite weird honestly. Charge Forth does not exclusively scale to Faith because it deals damage based on the weapon itself. Yet it has a higher faith scaling than strength or dexterity, but a lower fire damage. It actually still gives you more damage pushing faith to 50 points first, before either strength or dexterity. After that, pushing strength and dexterity is much better for the weapon versus pushing faith to 80 points. Since it has good scaling stats, the Girandole actually pulls off very high AR, especially at max stats despite also having bleed. The Cleanrot Spear gives a tiny bonus of 50 immunity when held, which honestly doesn't do much most of the time, but hey, a bonus is a bonus. It has a unique weapon art, Sacred Phalanx. The first part of the weapon art is purely physical, despite how it looks, while the second part is purely holy damage. This weapon also scales better to strength and dexterity, but the second part of the weapon art has a much larger radius. You'll end up with quite the mediocre AoE if you just invest in strength and dexterity. If you're not just a faith caster trying to use the Cleanrot Spear's weapon art, you definitely need to think long and hard on the proper distribution for your playstyle. If this is your main weapon, optimize it for your playstyle, thinking about how much poking and weapon art you're actually doing to find a good balance. However, I think the weapon art is weak despite how cool it looks. It doesn't do a lot of damage nor poise damage, and can be guarded by a shield despite coming out of the ground. Overall, a cool weapon. Powerful? Not really. I prefer using the short spear if I want to use the special heavy attack. For the regular spears, we have the Spear, Short Spear, Iron Spear, Partisan, Pike, Celebrant's Ribcage, Spiked Spear, Cross Naginata, and the Clayman's Harpoon, the only regular weapon that has magic damage and intelligence scaling at base, making it quite the famous weapon. To start off, there are 9 regular spears, but I'm going to display only 6 out of 9 of them. I'm eliminating Spear, Iron Spear, and Celebrant's Ribcage right now because the only advantage these spears have is their slightly lighter weight, which when you take into account endurance, always loses out versus other spear replacements by just dropping points from the respective offensive stat for endurance. They also don't have any unique movesets to consider, so other spears like the Spike Spear or Clayman's Harpoon are just straight up better than these spears, even if we ignore the Cross Naginata that has an even higher stat requirement and weight. Starting with a heavy infusion, we immediately notice that the Short Spear has a significantly lower attack rating, which will hold true for other infusions as well, so you really need to think hard on whether the unique heavy attacks are worth the attack loss. The Clayman's AR is the highest, only because it is a split scaling weapon. It isn't actually great as a heavy infusion option, and the damage you're dealing will almost certainly be lower than spears like the Cross Naginata or the Partisan, even at 56 strength, where lower stats favor having split scaling because of more free raw base stats. The Spike Spear and Partisan have the same special moveset. Because they're nearly identical in weight and length, I very much recommend the Spike Spear over the Partisan because you're trading very little amounts of attack for 50 bleed. It isn't that surprising that the Cross Naginata has the most attack, ignoring the Clayman's, because of its high stat requirement and weight, even though it scales better to dexterity. And these are their stats for AT strength. The Fire Infusion's AR difference for spears is not that great, even when we don't take into account counter hitting, assuming average fire defense and negation. Your enemy has to have significantly weaker fire negation than pierce negation in PvE, which doesn't happen that often. For PvP, negation tends to be about the same, while fire defense is high because of vigor. As previously introduced, counter hit damage only applies to physical damage, so the fire portion of the weapon does not benefit from counter hitting. If we take into account just a bit of counter hitting, the Fire Infusion is easily weaker than the Heavy Infusion, even at the 56 strength level, so we're not going to bother with 80 strength Fire Infusion, because Heavy Infusion is superior. The same thing applies to the Lightning Infusion, even though Lightning defense tends to be lower in PvP, so this is the 56 Dexterity Lightning Infusion page I'm providing. Overall, the raw physical versions, Heavy and Keen, are just better than the Fire or Lightning versions, even if you're only countering like 10 or 20% of the time. Ignoring Clayman's Harpoon for the Keen version, Partisan and Pike scale better to strength, while the rest scales better to dexterity. Since Spike Spear is basically a superior Partisan, you're pretty much just looking at Pike for heavy when it comes to optimizing. This is the 80 dexterity sheet for Keen. You can see an even larger difference between the Cross Naginata's AR and the Spike Spear's AR here. Unless you really like the Spike Spear's heavy attack, Cross Naginata is basically worth the extra stat point investment into strength and endurance for just about every infusion. Quality as usual is hot garbage until your stats are way past meta PvP level. This is your go-to for max level PvE physical builds. Flame and Sacred always have the same scaling, you're just deciding between the two elements. Either of these options suffer greatly from having low physical attack. These infusions won't be my first choice unless you're on Faith build and only use the spear to supplement your build. Notice, you can make the Clayman's Harpoon a 3 damage type weapon, but this is a horrible choice because now you suffer from 3 defenses. Please don't use the Clayman's for the Flame or Sacred infusion, and just stick to something like the Naginatas. For magic, Clayman's Harpoon does especially well since it already has magic base damage. I'm using 20 strength and 20 dexterity here to show the Cross Naginata and the Pike, but the Clayman's has a far lower stat requirement, which is very useful for mages who don't want to waste extra stats. The thing with Clayman's Harpoon though, is it benefits even less with counter hit versus other spears. Here's the AT intelligence sheet. You'll honestly only use the magic version if you don't often use the moveset of the spear itself and lean more towards casting spells or Ashes of War. As we move on to Code and the other status infusions, I want to add another layer of consideration here. Spears are very strong weapons to power stance because of their long reach and power stance moveset. You're pretty much encouraged to power stance spears over two-handing spears. You do more poise damage and damage with powerstancing, because the power stance moveset of spears is strong, and spears are just long and good at spacing. Most of the time, you'll probably be using a spear for its moveset. This leads us to the status effect infusions, which are very good for the spears as well, because their reach allows phantom status procs even when your enemy dodges. Code Infusion is actually a good choice, especially because you can forego investing hard into intelligence and still retain a relatively high attack rating at lower levels of investment versus poison or blood infusion because of the split scaling nature. This is a very good option for spears in general, especially if you're going to power stand something like the Cross Naginata. You can do one Keen and one Cold Cross Naginata in order to have a balance between Frost, Bleed, and bonus damage from physical counter. For poison, I only suggest running this on the Spike Spear or the Cross Naginata. It also provides a good option for power stancing, just like the Code Infusion. It has less AR than the Code Infusion, but the Code Infusion has to go through split scaling, and the magic portion also doesn't benefit from counter hitting. As for the Bleed Infusion, I've discussed several times already that Bleed Infusion overrides the base Bleed status effect instead of adding to it, while still keeping the AR deficit the same. This means that using a Bleed Infusion on a weapon with Bleed already makes the benefit from the infusion way weaker. Thus, I suggest running the Bleed Infusion only on the spears that don't already have Bleed. From our list, we see that the Bleed Infusion works particularly well with the Short Spear, the Partisan, and the Pike. Because status MV doesn't suffer from defense, Bleed works especially well with the Short Spear's heavy attack that applies much more status damage than the regular heavy attacks. Also, since the Spike Spear loses its advantage over the Partisan for having innate Bleed, a blood-infused Partisan is actually better than a blood Spike Spear, even though Spike Spear tends to beat the Partisan with all the other infusions. Finally, we have the Occult Infusion, which in my opinion is quite strong for the spear solely because the Cross Naginata scales quite well to Arcane. If you compare the Occult Naginatas to the Bleed Naginatas, you will immediately realize that you have more bleed buildup and attack rating. The only thing is you're sort of stuck into running two Occult Naginatas because you're mainly investing into Arcane, which honestly isn't a problem because of how good bleed is anyway. Some of the more observant viewers will wonder, why the heck does Cross Naginata have more bleed status buildup than the Spike Spear despite both of the weapons having the same exact bleed buildup at base? This doesn't happen for the Bleed Infusion either. This is because the number value behind the D rating of the arcane scaling of all poison and bleed infusions is a standard 30 for the spears. However, this is not true for the Occult Infusion. While both the Cross Naginata and the Spike Spear have a B rating in Arcane for Occult Infusion, the scaling value for the Cross Naginata is a 72, while the scaling value for the Spike Spear is 62. This makes the Cross Naginata a much better pick for the Occult Infusion. Let me give an example. Let's say your character is starting off with a low stat investment Occult Spike Spear at basic requirements and soft cap levels. Now, let's drop some Arcane for Naginata's requirements. You can drop 2 more points off Arcane for more endurance, and the Naginata will still be in the lead. Okay, let's say we have more than a few extra stat points to invest. Can the Spike Spear beat the Cross Naginata? Not really. Let's compare the lower investment Cross Naginata to the 80 Arcane investment Spike Spear. Because of the lower scaling post 56 Arcane scaling soft cap, despite the Occult Spike Spear having 24 more stat points here, its stats are still lower than the 56 Arcane Cross Naginata. Let's do a summary for the spears. For the unique spears, I only really recommend considering the Bolt of Gransax and the Death Ritual Spear. The Bolt of Gransax is a good option with a powerful weapon art, now that it is fast enough after the 1.04 update. You've probably seen this weapon one-shot or nearly one-shot people with its weapon art in invasion clips. It also has the second longest reach out of the spears. The Death Ritual Spear has an okayish weapon art that is certainly more geared towards PvE. You might be wondering about the Inquisitor's Girandole, because this weapon does come with bleed and have decent stats. The problem is, because of the type of scaling it has, it is better when you consider it at max stats with 99 points. At PvP levels, you can see it loses to the Cross Naginata even while it has higher stat investment. The additional AR due to split scaling will always lose to the raw damage, even if we ignore counter hitting, unless we're specifically talking about a PvE mob with very poor fire negation. This and it being locked into charge fort while being 0.5 weight lighter than the Cross Naginata made me eliminate the Girandole as an option. As for the regular options, Clayman's Harpoon is good for mages who are focusing mainly on intelligence. It has relatively low strength and dexterity requirements, and already has magic damage as part of its scaling. Because you don't focus on your melee attacks much, even if you trade away your physical damage for better magic scaling, it still works out better for mages. As for the short spear, I think it actually has a pretty interesting heavy attack playstyle, although it really only works in PvE rather than PvP. I recommend the blood infusion for this one. The pike is by far the longest spear, but you give up a significant chunk of attack, and it does not come with bleed. It really is up to you whether you want this trade-off. As a side note, it is probably the best spear to two-hand because it benefits from strength more than dexterity. Doing so allows you to more effectively kite around by holding block while running so that you don't pivot and get yourself killed when you're not targeting something. Finally, we have our Cross Naginata, which deserves its popularity as you've seen throughout the video. I know there are going to be salty players that will get annoyed, but I deal with facts. If the numbers check out like they do for the Cross Naginata, I will not be afraid to say it has a very powerful and versatile kit that lets it dominate in terms of raw stats while being the third longest relevant spear. I've shown you some potential Naginata powerstancing examples with these infusions throughout the regular section already. Like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Crite, signing out.